With no further ado, I introduce Dambisa Moyo.
Thank you and good afternoon. I have to tell you that the earlier part of the introduction is something that my mother would have been very proud of and my father would have actually believed it. But the latter part obviously is quite disconcerting because my parents often say to me, what's all the excitement about? Everything you say is incredibly obvious. And so when you talk about things like aid fueling corruption, I'd be surprised if anybody in here actually thinks, oh gosh, that's a really novel approach and new thinking there, real cutting edge. So thank you very much for being here. It's lunchtime, and so I know that people have actually sacrificed their time to be here. We're going to spend a bit of time, I hope, engaging in questions and answers at some point, because I think it's much more interesting that way. But let me start off by just saying that, some people say to me, well, you wrote a book on Africa and aid to Africa, and you're writing this book now about the West and basically the world in general, and global macro. What's the connection? Why have you made this great departure? And just to clarify, I have no interest in controversy at all. In fact, I quite like my private life and enjoy going to the supermarket and being able to buy my own fruits and vegetables without having to be harassed by anybody. And so, I want to just explain what the link is between these two books. And really, my backdrop in writing books is to appeal to reason. It's appeal to the reason of sensible people around the world who, like me, are sort of questioning the status quo. And as I said earlier, very many obvious points. But in linking my first book, Dead Aid, and this book, How the West Was Lost, the key thread between them is unintended consequences. The idea that we have good intentions to help Africa or to build strong Western economies, but unfortunately, many of those policies lead to bad economic outcomes. And throughout the discussion today, I'm going to focus on issues around how the West was lost, but of course, if people have questions around some of the arguments that I made in Dead Aid, I'd be very happy to comment on that as well. So let me start off by saying, we all know the joke that if you ask 10 economists for their opinion on the world, you get at least 20 answers. I think in the world that we live in right now, you're more likely to get sort of 40 answers from 10 economists. And I think that really underscores the uncertainty and sort of a lot of questions that we have about where the world is going right now. In fact, many of the comments coming out from economists and policymakers, sometimes they're boom-laden, other times they're doom-laden. There are issues around whether we're in a positive world, a negative world, what exactly is going on. In fact, if you look across three categories in particular, I think that it's pretty clear that there's not any consensus. So some economists right now are talking about the world sort of averting crisis, and in fact, there being a risk of inflation. In fact, Prime Minister Cameron has talked about inflation being a concern. But there are other economists who very convincingly argue that we're in a deflationary world. In fact, if you talk to many economists who focus on the US, they'll say, oh my gosh, interest rates are low. Are we going to actually see a comeback in the US economy? So economists don't know. We're split sort of, 50-50. And then governments also don't seem to really have much consensus. The UK government has adopted an approach of fiscal austerity, really focused on bringing balances both in the fiscal deficits but also in debts back in line. Well, the US approach is essentially completely different. The US is keeping interest rates low and is focusing on QE2, so the quantitative easing, really trying to pursue issues around fiscal expansion and tax cuts. And as we know, people who live in London and in Britain will know that the VAT hike just this year is obviously is an example of tax hikes, which is quite different from what's happening in the US. And then for people who focus on the markets, you only have to look at the way the markets are trading to also be somewhat surprised. On the one hand, if you open the newspapers, you see that there's a lot of discussion about how the stock markets are rallying and that there's been big improvements, and lots of cheer around stock markets. But then if you look at the bond markets, the interest rates are still incredibly low, which suggests that people are still quite concerned about the long-term prospects for economic growth. For most market participants, this is a good thing because the fact that there are some people who want to buy the market and other people who want to sell the market is essentially what creates a market. But for the rest of us, it's quite worrying because it's, to me, and certainly I think many people, it sort of smacks of uncertainty. Uncertainty around taxes, uncertainty around fiscal balances and what the governments are going to do with the fiscus, but it's also uncertainty around the banking and capital requirements, and uncertainty around industrial policy. I mean, what are we going to look like? So in approaching the discussion today, I wanted to just start off by saying, what is it that we can actually all agree on broadly? It doesn't have to be in the details or in the specifics, but broadly, what can we say or grope towards in terms of saying, you know what, broadly speaking, I think this is what the situation is. And I would argue that very broadly, the reality, or what I think the general consensus is, that the Western countries are broadly having economic problems, and places like China and the emerging world are broadly on the right track. So Western countries are broadly on the wrong track, and China and so on broadly on the right track. And in the course of the discussion today, I want to focus on three key ingredients, the three key ingredients that drive economic growth, which are capital, which is essentially money, labor, which is the workforce, both in terms of quality and quantity, but also in terms of productivity, issues around productivity. And for economists in the room, you'll know that of the three ingredients that contribute to economic growth, total factor productivity, this third component, is thought to contribute as much as 60% to economic growth. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So let us use these three variables as a guide for looking at whether our assumption that Western countries are broadly on the wrong track and China and so on, let's call them the rest, are broadly on the right track. What I would like to ultimately end up doing is talking about where it is we should be putting our efforts and energies given the way the world looks. So let's start with capital. And again, I really want to emphasize this idea of quality and quantity. I think we've read in the papers that there are a lot of issues around debts and deficits. It's not news. The US, for example, and I'll focus on the US here, a lot of this applies to the UK as well, and I do in the book talk about not just the US, also more generally European countries, including the UK. But given the President Hu Jintao, the president of China's visit to the US, and the vice premier's visit into the UK, I think it's probably a good idea to sort of do a US versus China as our starting point. We all know about the debts, we all know about the deficits. The US is still running around 60% of its debt to GDP. The forecasts from the IMF say that by 2020 it could be as high as 90, 100% debt to GDP ratios. They are on a path of heavy debts. We don't want to spend much time on that. Similarly, in terms of deficits, they're talking about 11% deficits. I mean, they're serious, unsustainable deficits as long as the US can't continue to raise money or doesn't invest its money properly. Broadly speaking, problems on their balance sheet. China, on the other hand, has a 9% debt to GDP ratio, incredibly low for an emerging country, but also it's got almost a surplus. It's about negative 0.4 on deficits. So just by way of comparison. But even moving away from the statistics, there's a more fundamental point, which is that in terms of just raw capital, the amount of money sitting on the balance sheet for China, they're talking about making about $1 billion a day just on interest. So they've got an inordinate amount of money, over $3 trillion in assets, as compared to $135 billion in the US. But again, I don't want people to focus on the macro numbers. The question is about how diffused or diversified are these capital flows. Much of the case, as is in Europe, and the US is that the money exists, but it's diffused around corporates, pension funds, and so it makes it very difficult for governments to act when there are problems, such as the financial crisis. In contrast, much of the money in China is pooled at the government level, and the government has much more flexibility and an ability to actually intervene and solve big questions such as energy or when there's a financial crisis. And we'll come back to this theme a little bit later. So that's broadly where we are on capital. I'm going to spend a bit of time on labor, both, as I said, quality and quantity. Some of the big themes that are running in Europe, and in the book I call this the next big Ponzi scheme, it's pensions. We all know that there's something going on, there's a problem, but nobody really wants to talk about what that number looks like. Clearly, we need to address the pension problem because it is a looming problem, given the trajectory of the population. But we're not hearing much about this. And remember, industries such as the coal industry, the steel industry, airline industry, auto industry in the United States in particular, have actually all gone under and have had to face bankruptcy because of the pension problem. So given that if that's a harbinger of anything in any way, I think the indications for what Western countries are going to have to do around the pension issue is incredibly important. Linked to pensions also is the issue of healthcare. It's great to offer healthcare to everybody, but if you can't finance it, you've got a problem. And some of the statistics coming out of the UK is that within the next 4 years, if you read some of the work by Sir John Oldham, who has done a lot of work for the NHS, we're talking about increases of around 250% in the next 4 years from diabetes, type 2 diabetes, and also a lot of other diseases that are associated with an aging population. So we've got this concern from pensions and healthcare, which again, we superficially know it's going on, but we really don't want to know the details. And our policymakers, and I'll come back to this later, are not incentivized to deal with these structural problems. So we're spending a lot more time talking about tactical issues, about how to stay alive, as opposed to really thinking about structural problems that are coming. I won't spend time on the fact that we know about the unfavorable demographics, which I just alluded to, the fact that the populations in the emerging world tend to be incredibly young. Across Africa, for example, 60% of the population is under the age of 24. If you look at places like in the Middle East and across the world, those statistics are very, very familiar. In contrast, you're seeing that 1 in 5 people, in some cases 1 in 3 people in the emerged world, the developed world, are actually on the sort of what they'd called an age dependency at the higher ages. So we've got an issue there. And given the fact that immigration has become such a big problem and labor is such a big ingredient for economic growth, we have to start to question ourselves, what is Europe going to look like? What is the US going to look like if we're not able to attract new talent from around the world? And then finally, with respect to quality around labor, we all know the statistics, and again, you don't have to believe me, you can go to PISA, PISA, which is basically linked to the OECD, or the TIMSS survey, which is the trends in mathematics and sciences, and have a look at the performance of the United States, the UK, and many European countries in terms of mathematics and sciences. And again, this is often in the newspapers, but the question becomes, what exactly are we doing about it? President Obama in the US mentioned that for the first time in one generation, the US is ranked 12th in terms of people who are graduating from college. So you're seeing standards slipping quite dramatically, and this is very seriously a problem because, as we know, the emerging world, in particular places like China and India, are actually able to tap into manufacturing and agriculture, because those require less education. And the places where Europe and the United States have a competitive edge, such as R&D, such as technology, require a lot of education, but we simply have not invested. So we've got another structural problem. We're not able to compete internationally in the manufacturing sector, but we've not invested in the sectors where we actually should be able to compete. Finally, as I said, we've talked about capital, talked about labor, total factor productivity, which is that sort of mystery catch-all, which accounts for about 60% of why it is countries grow. The fact of the matter is, with the United States, they have seen productivity improve, but the reality, which is quite a stark reality, is that China's productivity gains have been the largest productivity gains in the history of economics registering productivity growth. Now, we can argue about where they're getting that productivity growth. I mean, some people in the room might argue, oh, they're just taking Western technology, and actually productivity should be increasing quite rapidly. But nevertheless, it's quite a key piece of the puzzle. But beyond what I just said, there's a more fundamental problem, which is that the Western countries are seeing productivity gains amongst people who are at that high level of education in technology, in R&D, but it's a relatively small proportion of the broader labor market. The productivity from people who are working in places like manufacturing or construction is arguably on the decline because they're not able to compete with people in the emerging markets. So the question then becomes, in as much as we look at capital, labor, and productivity, I think it's pretty clear that we've got this broad picture of Western countries having problems with capital, the amount of money, and as we know, the United States is borrowing about 30% of its borrowings come from China now, but also looking at labor, as I said, the pension issues, healthcare issues that we know about, we're just not spending enough time really trying to resolve these problems, and then obviously around technology and total factor productivity, as I talked about a minute ago. So what does this mean? What does it mean in terms of what are the choices for a country like the United States, which, by the way, as we know, is still struggling with a 9.5, almost 10% unemployment rate. It translated about 30 million Americans out of work, who are particularly in the manufacturing and construction sector. So the thesis I'd like to put forward today is that the United States faces what I'm calling a Hobson's choice. It can either stay open and continue to trade and to have full-fledged capital flows and trade flows, or it could become much more protectionist and much more closed. And I'm just going to argue on why it is or what the implications of these two choices are. But before I do that, I just want to be perfectly clear. I am a big supporter of free trade. I believe that actually there are gains to be had for all if we do subscribe to the theoretical concept of free trade, free markets, free movement of capital. I would actually argue of labor as well. But the reality is we live in the real world, and to quote General McChrystal, Stanley McChrystal, who used to be the head of the US forces, armed forces in Afghanistan, we have to remember and we have to focus on where we are today as opposed to where we would like to be. And that's kind of a reality check, because the fact of the matter is virtually all countries are involved and do participate in forms of protectionism. If you read the media, you would think that China is the only one guilty of this, in particular because of the way they manipulate their foreign exchange. But the fact of the matter is, we as living in Western countries such as the US and European countries are absolutely as guilty on this matter of protectionism as well. Classic example of this, of course, is subsidies to Africa around agriculture, where hundreds of billions of dollars over time have been diverted towards subsidizing farmers. And obviously the implications of that for African farmers in terms of jobs, in terms of income, and obviously in terms of Africa becoming a key player in the global marketplace have been incredibly damaging. And just to illustrate, Africa has got 1 billion people, compared to around 30 million, I think it is, in Spain. And Africa represents 2% of global trade. It's roughly equivalent, if not less, than Spain's contribution to global trade. And a lot of this has got to do with the fact that Africa is simply not able to contribute to the global economy. So let's focus a little bit on the option of being open, staying open. And I've given you the caveat that open is in inverted commas because we know that these countries all engage in protectionism. So as much as everybody says, oh, protectionism is bad and China is bad for manipulating its currency, let's temper down and remember that we're doing the same thing. But nonetheless, it's pretty clear that the United States policy is trying very aggressively to solve its key problems around education, around energy efficiency, around infrastructure, all of which I might add are detailed in the book, within the context of staying open and participating with the rest of the world. Very quickly, some examples. The Obama Science and Technology Bill, which is basically prescribed 3% of US GDP, which would support science and technology. They've also earmarked over $45 billion. The government in the US has earmarked over $45 billion towards infrastructure projects. And obviously, if you read the Carnegie Mellon speech that President Obama made last year, they are ostensibly committed to finding an alternative solution to the energy problem. All of that sounds great, and I'm a big supporter of all those key elements, and I do think they need to happen. However, I think there are two fundamental problems with the US staying open. Number one, these programs are far too narrow, given the structural problems. The decline in education in the United States, as an example, has happened over many decades. So to simply throw 3% of GDP at the problem at this stage is unlikely to really reverse what has actually been an erosion over time. So it's a good start, but not good enough in terms of what needs to happen. Things need to be much bolder, much more aggressive, much bigger in terms of their programs. And obviously, the issue around do they have money to finance this is something we'll come to in a moment. Some people would argue spending $1 trillion, I think it is, in Afghanistan every year is an example of how the US is underwriting global public goods and actually needs to start thinking about rediverting some of that. And I'm not a political scientist, so I'm not here to debate that argument, but just to argue or to throw out the point that there are choices that the US has made in terms of actually underwriting global public goods, things that we all benefit from, security in the world, policing the sea lanes, but the US may be underwriting those things at the expense of the US economy. But I said there are two problems with staying open. The other problem is that it really, really relies on everybody else playing fair. And by fair, I mean playing in a way, in a policy way, that actually can help benefit the US. And if the problem really is that they've got 50 million Americans, 30 to 50 million Americans out of work, then playing fair would be somehow being able to bring those people back into the workforce who are in, as I said, manufacturing, largely in manufacturing. But the problem is to expect that China is going to somehow move its currency so that it can benefit the US is something that we can't be sure of, because China actually does benefit from the way the currency is pegged for now. So the issues here, as I said, from staying open, number one, it has to be much more aggressive because they've got serious problems in education and so on, in healthcare and infrastructure and so on. But at the same time, it really does depend on everybody else playing fair because in order to solve this inherent problem. Very quickly, what are the risks? So let's suppose the US says, you know what, we're going to stay on the status quo, the path as we are. We're going to stay open, and we're simply going to try to juggle everything, underwrite global goods, and at the same time continue to try and compete in the world. Well, I think one of the problems, or a number of problems, emerge from that. And first of all, the obvious one is that labor in the US is too costly. It's too expensive when you compare it to places in the emerging world. So what you might see is that an increase in income inequality, because the world would be very happy to pay a premium for people who are contributing to the global economy, if you're a technology expert or so on. But for manufacturing, I think it'll be very difficult for Americans who are involved in the manufacturing sector to compete. Further implications of that is that you might see, and you're likely to see, an increase in the welfare state, if I may use with a small w. I don't want to get stoned. But what do I mean by that? I mean, already, almost 47% of Americans do not pay federal taxes. So you've already got a system where a lot of people are not paying the taxes, and moreover, in terms of public sector, and I don't know if people will be surprised by this, I was incredibly shocked, but if you go back to 1980 until today, people who are working in the public sector are earning, in terms of total compensation, are earning more than $10,000 more than the people working in private sector in the United States. So it's a huge differential already happening. So you've got this as a backdrop, and the question is, how does, over time, if you've got 50 million people that you can't redeploy to compete in the global economy, how do you solve that? So, where does this leave us? It leaves us with the other option, which is to go closed. And again, in the interest of not being, I was labeled a baby killer. I was against African babies when I wrote Dead Aid. So I want to be clear here that I don't end up getting labeled as some crazy person who's against trade. Let's just be clear. I support free trade. I think it's a fantastic thing, and I think the free markets, albeit in a managed way, are still the best way at delivering the largest amount of economic growth and freedom, as we can see from historical context. However, that being said, becoming more closed and more protectionist than we already are in the Western society is definitely an option that's on the table. Some people might view it as a nuclear option, but it is an option. In fact, if you look at some of the surveys, it was a fringe issue for sure in the US, but increasingly more Americans are now saying, well, hang on a second, maybe protectionism is the only way out, given the circumstances that I've just outlined for you. There's a survey that came out a few weeks ago that says that 30% of college-educated Americans actually think that protectionism is a viable alternative. So it's not something that's off the table. But I want to just focus on a study that came out of the University of Chicago, which I thought was also quite illuminating, not just for the US, but for Europe in general. And I urge you to have a look at it. It's cited in the book, but it's a very interesting study. They compared two periods. They compared 1950 and 1980, so those 30 years, with 1980 and 2007. So it's about 30 years each, roughly. And for people who are interested in this type of area, you'll know that 1950 to 1980, the world was pretty much closed. It wasn't as bad as when we lived in the Smoot-Hawley era, when tariffs were as high as 80% on some goods. But clearly there were tariffs and the world was much more insular. Countries were much more insular. Obviously, from 1980 through the Reagan and Thatcher era to 2007, the world is much more global, much more integrated, and so on. But the interesting statistics that come out from comparing these two periods are quite scary. First of all, they find that the US in particular grew by around 2.1% at the time when it was closed, and it's grown by 2.1% on average in the time that it's been open. So we've not seen the gains from globalization that we would have liked to see. In addition, we've seen that incomes, real wages of Americans, and not just Americans, Europeans as well, have remained relatively flat. So remember that the idea for globalization, one of the big ideas was that we people living in the West would be able to sell more goods because people in China were coming up the ranks and would want to buy British and American goods. What's actually happened is that because there's been so much competition, the wages in the US and Europe have actually remained pretty flat. So again, what we're seeing is that a lot of the gains of globalization and the emergence of these emerging economies have accrued to people who own capital, but have not necessarily accrued to the people who own the labor. And one of the more sort of horrendous pieces of evidence from this is that there have been gains to labor, but the gains that labor holders have had over this period have actually come in the form of debt. So instead of seeing wages increase, which is what theory would tell us, actually people have had more access to debt, and now we've ended up in a situation where wages have not increased, but we've ended up with a lot more debt. I want to also just give one more statistic, which has to do with income inequality. People talk a lot about the fact that, globalization is going to raise all boats and it's all going to be wonderful. Well, actually, if you look at income inequality, the richest 1% have seen their incomes increase 3 times. The poorest 10% have seen their income only increase by 10%. This is in Western countries. So it's this theme that actually maybe there hasn't been that much upside. And I really stress this only in the context of protectionism, increased protectionism being an option, and not just as a theoretical case, but more as a political case going forward. The last thing I'll just say here is it's worth having a look at the inaugural speech of FDR, President Roosevelt in the US, where he does talk about, and I'm paraphrasing, I do have the exact speech if you're interested, he paraphrases that, that essentially the United States is very keen on having international trade relations, but ultimately, trade relations are secondary to a strong national economy. And I think it's quite poignant that it's actually President Roosevelt, a diehard Democrat, who made this statement, because it is increasingly going to become an issue less of left or right or Democrat versus Republican. It's an issue about the US and European survival in terms of being able to compete aggressively over time. I think it's probably worth me stopping here. The last point I'll make, and then I'll sit down, is to say what I'm proposing here is that we need to focus on the structural problems. We're so obsessed and consumed by tactical issues, tactical problems, bank bonuses, fiscal deficits. All of that matters. But in the broader scheme, in terms of Britain, the US, and in the Western countries becoming more competitive and being able to sustain themselves as economies over the longer time, we've got to shift our thinking away from just tactical short-term myopia into much more longer-term issues around resource constraints and some of the big themes that I've talked about here. And unfortunately, because of the political system that we live in, and this is the point of democracy, and by the way, I also love democracy. I'm not a democracy hater. I just don't think it's a prerequisite for economic development. But in the context of democracy, one of the reasons it's been an Achilles heel in Western countries is that the fact that you have such regular cycles, in the US it's every 2 years, it's midterms and then presidential elections, you're simply governments are not incentivized or rewarded for focusing on the structural problems, which take a longer time. And my proposal, suggestion there is perhaps you don't have to end up being an anti-democratic society, but there are ways that if you look at some of the Latin American, South American countries, they have longer terms, one term for a longer period. And I just think, for example, you can do a 7-year term for, one 7-year term, instead of having these multiple cycles, which simply don't give governments enough time, or policymakers enough time to deal with the more structural issues. Let me stop there. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions. I guess we'll go to Hugo. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much, Dambisa. I'm going to have a couple of questions first before we throw it open to the floor. I mean, one question I'd like to put to you. Dambisa, obviously, as you pointed out very eloquently, there have been these great returns to capital from globalization, but not to labor. In that is true if you look at labor in the West, but if you take a sort of man from Mars perspective or a global citizen perspective, there have been huge returns to labor. You have had the hundreds of millions of Chinese being taken out of poverty, maybe even hundreds of millions of Indians being taken out of poverty. So as from a sort of global citizen perspective, isn't all this rather good news?
Oh, absolutely. Listen, I come from the emerging world, so it's great news for us. But the book is not entitled How China Was Lost. It's entitled How the West Was Lost. And obviously, places like China and the rest of the emerging world have serious concerns and constraints of their own. Let me not give you the impression that things are wonderful there. They do have serious issues. But the broader point about the global, and this is the floating all boats, the issue here is that we are likely to be facing serious resource constraints. And the question becomes, can the world really support 9 billion people, which are the projections for 2050? Can we really afford to have a billion 3 Chinese people consuming and living as we do in the West today? And by all indications, looking at arable land, looking at water, looking at energy, and looking at things like minerals, the indications are that we simply are not going to be able to get there, even if we start to come back or reduce our amount of waste and so on. So the fundamental point is, are Westerners willing to reduce their living standards in the interest of seeing China rise? And just to really drive home the point, I think it's really important to understand, or at least my argument is that China is going to keep on growing. And it's also going to grow faster than Western countries. I think all indications of capital, labor, and total factor productivity that I just mentioned indicate that they will continue to grow. But the jury is still out about whether or not China and these emerging countries will actually be able to converge to per capita income levels that we're seeing in the West. But in a world, in a global world where we're fighting for or competing for limited or finite resources, the issue does become how willing are we to cut back on how much we consume?
Yeah, but we may not have so many choices. And I mean, I just wonder, I mean, the idea that the West has some sort of God-given right to lord it over the East or the South, I mean, this may have been a sort of philosophy during the Great Imperial Age, but I mean, you know, there's no evidence that the people in the West are any smarter than people in the East. There's, you know, and as the power sort of reduces, I mean, it's sort of almost natural, isn't it, that you talked about greater inequality within say America, between rich and poor, which clearly there has been. But again, if you take the sort of man from Mars perspective, I think the evidence on Gini coefficients is that there's actually been a reduction in global inequality. So this is a sort of, you know, it may not be very pleasant if you're an auto worker in America or a construction worker in Spain or something, but it's sort of, you know, I mean, the West has had its several good centuries, and now it's sort of, there are things that can be done, clearly. Structural reforms, pension reforms, some of these things are being done. You know, I mean, in Europe at the moment, I mean, you know, the crisis is actually forcing some of these changes. But what can be done is, to some extent, it's at the margin, isn't it?
Well, I'm much more sanguine than you are. You know, I hear this argument a lot, that it's inevitable, China's bigger than us. You know, if you go back and look at some of the data from Angus Madison, who I talk about in the book, he came up with this brilliant database going back to 1500s. And I mean, at that time, places like China and India were 30% of the world's GDP. These were massive, massive players. And so we fast forward to today, and people think, you know what, in the grand scheme of things, Europe has been Europe and the US have been a slight aberration. We're now reverting to the mean, which is that China and India should be the main dominant countries. I don't really subscribe to that. I mean, I think all indications are that we're on that path now. But I would argue that a lot of people, and this is probably where Western policymakers are making an error, they're so obsessed with what China's doing that they're actually not focusing on their own policies and some of the problems that they've created that are eroding your stance. I mean, a sort of simplistic comparison would be the difference between a billionaire and a millionaire. A billionaire, to continue being a billionaire, maybe needs to just earn 1% on his billion. A millionaire, to converge to becoming a billionaire, is going to have to grow by a very substantial amount. And there'll be obviously bumps and constraints in getting to that billion. And I mean, that, you know, obviously, just to state the obvious, if people didn't pick up the analogy, I think Western countries are at the sort of billionaire stage. They have, you know, great capital. They've got, you know, traditionally, they've invested in infrastructure, they've invested in their people, and they do have, you know, in terms of innovation and some of the technological feats that the world still needs, they have been leaders in that area. But they are giving away that lead. And it's, you know, it's less about focusing on what China's doing. It's basically about looking at what it is the US and Europe are doing to actually erode their prospects.
But before I will just throw it open, but one final thing before we,
Yeah.
I mean, there are, though, as you hinted in your introductory remarks, there are problems in you talk about, I like this phrase, the West and the rest. There are problems in the rest as well as problems in the West. And I mean, there's one view which I just returned from India I was there last week, and I mean, their corruption is rife. In China, I mean, it's dramatic. It seems to have increased. In China, there is a big question of whether its extraordinary growth rate that we've seen over the last 30 years can actually be sustained into the future without some sort of political changes, and whether that can be done without a sort of dislocation. And then you look at other parts of the world. I don't know if your book talks about this, but the whole sort of Muslim world, where there are big governance issues, whether there's Muslim fundamentalism or sort of absolutist regimes. I mean, don't you feel that the West has got something, I mean, of course, democracy slows you down. It does mean that you have to debate things, and there's short-termism and politicians who are just, looking after the next opinion poll. But don't you think that there's some benefit that comes from that, and that the problems, the governance problems in the rest of the world may come back to haunt them?
Well, the short answer is it's too soon to tell. I mean, it's too soon to call. I think political scientists, and my inclination living in a democratic, free society is, yes, that might be a problem. But we have no evidence to believe that's the case. I just spent 2 weeks in China, and it's absolutely heaving. I mean, I don't know if anybody has been there recently, but I traveled, went to Singapore. I mean, Singapore has just posted 14% growth. I mean, this is a country that is, in terms of per capita income levels, rivals the emerged or developed countries. So how is it possible that they're still able to post these levels of economic growth? Is governance important? Absolutely. However, we have got a particular framework that we've convinced ourselves is the only framework of doing things. I mean, my point about being in China recently is I asked people, how important is democracy? People say, well, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I need food on my table first, and then I can discuss these other issues. And I think maybe the Chinese government, other governments are riding on that, but thus far it's been relatively successful. Of course, there have been issues of governance and so on, but I think it's too much of a stretch for us, given the information that we know, Chile, places like Singapore, what China's done in terms of being able to post such extraordinary levels of economic growth on a sustained basis. It's very difficult for us to sit here and point fingers and say, well, actually, that's a bad system of governance. And I might point out, spending time in China, there's a lot of grassroots democracy, and there are a number of papers on this that I think are quite interesting. I mean, for sure, the system of democracy has not permeated at the level, at the sort of senior level of governance, but definitely in terms of lower villages and in the general way that politics is run on the ground in China, it's not the case that there's zero democracy and things are run in a centralized manner. I think we need to be a bit more open about the fact that there are alternative ways of achieving economic growth. And I think part of the problem is that if you go to school or educated in the West, there's a sort of presumption that the model of economic growth and development is a particular one that we all must subscribe to. But what China and India and so on have done is to prove to us in the past 30 years that it's actually very possible to achieve significant levels of economic growth on a sustained basis and to materially reduce poverty by adopting a different approach.
I see.